In a museum storage room in Iraq sits a clay tablet, roughly 4,000 years old, that was never meant to be read by anyone outside a temple. Its surface is covered in cuneiform, the oldest writing system ever deciphered, pressed into wet clay by a scribe whose name no one remembers, in a city that no longer exists. It names a real region, real rivers, a real word used by real farmers to describe a real piece of land. That word is Edin, and that single word is about to unravel everything you think you know about paradise. Before it appeared in Genesis as the name of Eden, Edin was simply the Sumerian term for flat farmland, the kind of unremarkable word a Bronze Age scribe might use in a tax record. Nothing sacred about it at all. So how did a humble word for flatland become the most famous lost paradise in human history? And why does every trail back to its origin lead to the same ancient civilization? Over the next several minutes, we follow that trail, a candidate location for Eden traced by satellite imagery decades after the Bible was first written, a Sumerian paradise myth that predates Genesis by over 1,000 years, a Mesopotamian first man whose story mirrors Adam almost beat for beat, a fragment of human DNA that has split scientists and provoked theorists alike, and a banned religious text the early church tried, quite literally, to erase. Some of what follows is settled fact. Some of it is live, unresolved academic debate, and some of it is speculation that mainstream scholarship firmly rejects. We will tell you which is which, clearly, every step of the way. Let's start with the word itself. Genesis describes Eden with unusual geographic precision for a creation myth, not floating in clouds, a location, somewhere east, with 4 named rivers flowing out of it: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. 2 of those rivers are real and still flow today through modern Iraq and Turkey. Real rivers in a paradise myth. That single detail is why scholars have spent over a century treating Eden not as fantasy, but as a geographic puzzle waiting to be solved. And the word Eden is the first piece. Mainstream linguists widely trace it to the Sumerian Edun, meaning a fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, the same comparative philology that traces father back through Latin pater. Mainstream, not fringe. Naming the land is one thing. Finding it is another. And that search produced one of the strangest detective stories in biblical scholarship. 2 of Eden's rivers are easy. The other 2, the Pishon and the Gihon, vanished from history entirely. Or so it seemed, until satellites entered the picture. In the 1990s, archaeologist Juris Zarins examined Landsat imagery of the Arabian Peninsula and found the unmistakable trace of an ancient, long-dried riverbed running toward the head of the Persian Gulf, the Wadi al-Batn. He proposed it was the Pishon. Researcher James Sauer, working independently, agreed the match was too close to ignore. If they are right, Eden's rivers did not vanish into myth. They vanished into the desert, leaving fossil evidence that 19th century readers had no way to see. But 20th century satellites could capture in a single photograph. Other scholars remain cautious. The Gihon has competing candidates, the Karun and the Diyala among them, and no single answer commands consensus. But nearly every serious researcher agrees on the general region, where the Tigris and Euphrates approach the Persian Gulf, the same patch of earth modern archaeology already calls the cradle of civilization. Eden's geography keeps pointing to exactly where civilization itself appears to have begun. which raises an uncomfortable question. Was Edin remembered because it was unique, or because it was simply the first place worth remembering? Because the Sumerians who lived in that exact region were not just naming the land. They were already telling stories about losing a paradise there, at least 1,000 years before a single word of Genesis was written down. So which paradise came first? And is it possible Genesis didn't invent Eden at all, but inherited it? To answer that, we go to a Sumerian myth called Enki and Ninhursag, inscribed on tablets from the ancient city of Nippur. The myth describes a sacred land, called Dilmun. No lion kills. No wolf takes a lamb. No one grows old. Paradise on earth, and most Archaeologists date this text at least a millennium before the Hebrew scriptures. A paradise myth older than Eden. So is Dilmun just a story, or is it somewhere you could actually point to on a map? Unlike Eden, Dilmun is not lost to geography. Since the 1880s, when Henry Rawlinson first proposed the connection, archaeologists have built the case that Dilmun was real. The island of Bahrain, where 20th century excavations confirmed an entire Bronze Age trading civilization, shipping copper and pearls between Mesopotamia and the distant Indus Valley. This part of the puzzle is not myth. It is excavated fact, a real paradise land, a short sail from the mouth of the very rivers Genesis names. And yet Bahrain holds a detail archaeology still cannot explain. The island is scattered with the remains of more than 200,000 ancient burial mounds, one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric graves on Earth. Why a small desert island became the resting place of choice for so many people across so many centuries remains a genuinely open question, entirely separate from the paradise mythology layered on top of it later. Mainstream historians stop short of calling Dilmun and Eden identical, but a perfect garden at the meeting point of rivers, free of suffering. That resemblance is taken seriously enough to appear in academic biblical commentary, not just documentaries. And the parallels don't stop with the setting. They extend into the story of the first man himself. Here is where mainstream scholarship offers something most popular retellings of Eden skip entirely, a figure named Adapa. Adapa appears in tablets from Tel El Amarna in Egypt and the library of Ashurbanipal, with the oldest Sumerian version possibly reaching back to the early 2nd millennium BCE. He is the wise first man, created by the god Ea, ruler of Eridu, one of the oldest cities ever excavated. The myth opens almost comically. Adapa goes fishing. A sudden south wind capsizes his boat. Furious, he breaks the wind's wing, silencing it for 7 days. The sky god Anu, baffled by the sudden stillness, summons him to explain himself. It is at the gates of heaven that the story turns toward Eden. Anu offers Adapa the bread and water of immortality, but Ea, his own creator, has secretly warned him beforehand not to touch either. Adapa obeys and loses eternal life through obedience to instructions he never understood. A wise first man, a divine warning about forbidden food, a loss of immortality through obedience, not defiance. If that sounds familiar, scholars noticed first. Bible Odyssey, a project of the Society of Biblical Literature, states plainly that Adapa's name is etymologically linked to Adam, and that Adapa, like Adam, is called the seed of humankind. Published, peer-reviewed, not fringe. But scholars disagree sharply about what that similarity actually proves. Some argue the Adapa myth was directly reworked by Hebrew scribes. Eridu recast as Edin, Ea recast as God, the forbidden food recast as the forbidden fruit, even the serpent traced to Ea's own symbolic imagery in earlier Sumerian art. Historian Mario Liverani pushes back hard against this kind of one-to-one matching, arguing earlier comparisons forced superficial parallels onto texts with genuinely different theological structures, though even he concedes a real structural relationship survives once those differences are properly accounted for. So even the experts who study this for a living cannot agree on how directly connected these stories are. What they do agree on is that the resemblance is real and cannot be waved away as coincidence, which leaves an unanswered question hanging over the entire field. If Edin has this much company in Mesopotamian literature, why does popular culture only ever talk about the Bible's version? Because there is a separate, stranger thread the early church tried, quite literally, to erase. Most people today have never read the Book of Enoch. That is not an accident. Fragments turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, proving it circulated for centuries before Christ. It was widely read by the early church. Then, around the 4th century, the scholar Jerome labeled it apocryphal, and it vanished from Western tradition for over 1,000 years, surviving complete only in an Ethiopian translation, rediscovered by European travelers in the 1700s. A widely read text, suddenly erased for over a millennium. What was in it that needed erasing this thoroughly? Enoch describes angelic watchers who descend to earth, take human wives, and teach forbidden knowledge. Weapons, metalworking, divination. Knowledge, the text says, humanity was not ready to hold. Their offspring are the Nephilim, a phrase Genesis mentions in a single sentence and barely explains. Enoch spends chapters on them instead. A violent race whose bloodshed becomes one of the central reasons the flood was sent. One sentence in Genesis. Chapters in Enoch, describing the exact same verses. Something was left out of the official version, or added generously into the unofficial one. There's a second buried detail. The same 4 verses that introduce the Nephilim also have God cap human lifespans at 120 years, a strange, specific number with no explanation, sitting right beside the Bible's only mention of a hybrid race. Why pair those 2 details in the same breath? Even mainstream commentators still debate it, and the timing of Enoch's removal turns out to matter more than it should. For 3 centuries after Christ, the dominant reading held those sons of God were genuinely angelic. Then, in the very same 4th century Jerome was excluding Enoch, the theologian Augustine popularized a different reading entirely, simply the human line of Seth, no angels involved. 2 changes to the same handful of verses. Same century. Coincidence or cleanup? Historians aren't certain, and that uncertainty is exactly why the question keeps resurfacing. Some alternative researchers go further, proposing Enoch preserves genuine suppressed memory, real knowledge transmitted by beings the original authors had no word for beyond watchers. Mainstream historians reject this firmly. Nearly every ancient culture tells some version of divine beings mingling with early humans, which makes singling out one text as concealed fact hard to justify. Early writers like Jude and Tertullian still quoted Enoch directly, proof it once carried real theological weight before it was written out of the story entirely. So why was this particular text excluded this thoroughly? And right when the church was also rewriting who the sons of God even were. Which brings us to the strangest, most misunderstood piece of this entire story. It doesn't come from a museum. It comes from inside your own cells. In 2004, geneticists confirmed what earlier research had long suspected. Human chromosome 2 is the product of an ancient fusion between two smaller chromosomes. Chromosomes that remain separate in chimpanzees and bonobos, who carry 24 pairs to our 23. One missing pair, a gap that puzzled biologists for decades before anyone could explain it. The proof was specific: inverted telomeric sequences, the protective caps normally found only at chromosome ends, sitting in the middle of chromosome 2, exactly where two fused ends should leave a scar. Beside it, a degraded second centromere, the leftover signature of one of the original chromosomes. Then the evidence got stronger in a place no one expected: ancient DNA. Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes carry that same fused arrangement, the same degraded centromere. Proof the fusion happened in a shared ancestor long before modern humans existed. A fact that should have closed the case entirely. So why hasn't it? Online, this same data point gets stripped of that context constantly. Some communities propose the fusion was not natural at all, a genetic signature of deliberate intervention, sometimes tied to theories about advanced beings shaping early humanity. But the Neanderthal evidence alone undercuts that theory. No one proposes Neanderthals were engineered, yet they carry the identical signature, pointing to natural inheritance, not intervention. A second, smaller camp, religious researchers rejecting evolution on theological grounds, argue the sequence evidence itself is more ambiguous than presented. Geneticists have answered those specific objections directly, and the fusion model remains well supported, especially by that ancient genome corroboration. One real genetic event, two unrelated camps of doubt. Neither one the evidence actually supports, yet both still circulating, tangled together, every single day online. There is one more detail worth pausing on before we close. Not a theory, an image. The image of the gate itself. After the expulsion, Genesis tells us cherubim guard Eden's entrance, armed with a flaming sword that turns every direction, permanently sealing the way back in. Why describe the lock so vividly if the gate was never meant to be approached again? The Hebrew cherub likely derives from the Akkadian caribou, tied to a class of protective guardian spirits well documented in Mesopotamian art. Winged, hybrid beings carved into temple gateways throughout the ancient Near East, precisely to guard sacred and forbidden thresholds. The guardians of Eden are not a uniquely biblical invention. They belong to a visual vocabulary that was already old, already standing watch over doorways, throughout the exact region where Eden itself is said to have stood. A paradise, a first man, a forbidden act, a guardian at the gate. Piece by piece, the furniture of Eden keeps turning up in a civilization that existed long before the Bible gave that furniture its most famous name. So which came first, the memory or the myth built to explain it? We have a word, Edin, whose Sumerian origin is mainstream consensus, a candidate river system traced by satellite, a Mesopotamian paradise, Dilmun, actually excavated. A first man, Adapa, linked to Adam in peer-reviewed scholarship. A banned text, Enoch, read as theology by most and as something else by a few. A genetic fusion, real and well documented, that has become a magnet for speculation the evidence itself does not support. None of this proves Edin was a literal, locatable place. None of it proves the theories built on top of these facts. What it proves is quieter and more unsettling. The deeper you dig, the more company this story turns out to have. Written by other hands, in other languages, centuries before anyone wrote the version most of us grew up with. So why does almost every ancient culture near these river valleys remember a garden, a first man, a forbidden act, and an exile? Mainstream scholarship has answers. Shared rivers, shared trade routes, oral traditions reshaped at every border crossing for thousands of years, the way a single melody can travel village to village and emerge, generations later, sounding entirely new. By that account, Edin requires nothing extraordinary, just thousands of years of one fertile, fought-over region, telling its descendants where they came from. But that explanation still doesn't answer why the feeling of the story, paradise, transgression, the ache to return, sits this deep in so many unrelated cultures, all of them reaching for the same shape of story, before they had any way to compare notes. Maybe that is the real mystery, not whether Edin was a place on a map, but why losing it is a story humanity could not stop telling, in civilization after civilization, long before anyone called it by that name.